This week on the Communicators, two members of the European Parliament talk about the differences between European and American Internet policy and Europe's approach to Internet development, privacy, and technology.
Well, this is the Communicators on C-SPAN, where each week we look at telecommunications policy. And this week we're pleased to be joined by two members of the European Parliament to look at how the EU approaches telecommunications policy. Let me introduce them to you. First, we have Marietje Schaake. She represents the Netherlands in the European Parliament, and she's a member of the party Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. We also have joining us James Elles, a member of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom, who's a member of the Conservative Party. To both of you, welcome to the Communicators. We appreciate it. Also joining us as our guest reporter is Kim Hart of the Politico, one of our regulars. If I could start and tell us why, Mr. Ellis, why are you in town this week in Washington?
Well, I, with a number of my colleagues from Europe and from the business and the academic community, are here as part of a transatlantic week to engage with our American counterparts on a number of key issues which we think will be critical for our future of how the transatlantic economy can be competitive in the future. So dealing with financial convergence, demography, the debt and deficit problems, because of course they're on both sides of the Atlantic and not just yourselves grappling with how you cope with increasing debt, digital agenda, research, innovation, all these subjects where we hope by the end of the week to have a number of good ideas which we can deepen over the months ahead.
And Marietje Schaake, if you would, just overall, how does the EU approach telecommunications policy with 27 member nations? And how is it different from how the U.S. approaches telecommunications policy in your view?
Well, I think one of our main challenges at the moment is to actually make sure that Europe's digital market gets harmonized. Both friends and critics of the EU think that the harmonized market has brought us a lot of stability and profit and a healthy economy overall. But online, this is not the same. And the fragmentation that we find in Europe's digital market and digital sphere more broadly is what distinguishes it from the US, where it's actually, one market. And I think we need to overcome that fragmentation in Europe to be competitive in the world and to provide for the best services for our consumers, our citizens, for our artists to share their creations, and to make the best of what Europe has to offer in terms of online content as well.
Now, Mr. Ellis, you're one of the founders of the European Internet Foundation as well. What would you say is one of the biggest challenges facing telecommunications in Europe, and what do you do differently than the U.S. does?
Well, I'd like to tune in on the same wavelength as Marietje just then, because where we might just simply put in the 19th century it's the railways, the 20th century it was the airline, now 21st century it's the digital infrastructure that we need. You see Asia making huge strides in Singapore, South Korea, as if money's no object to get the highest speeds of broadband for households. And one senses both in the United States and in Europe, and here's I think a common ground, we don't have the leadership necessary to understand the real importance of having a universal access of information and of infrastructure to people across the land. So I was at a conference with the Woodrow Wilson Center yesterday, where apparently there's been an estimate made to get the digital access for everybody in the state. You need a sum about 500 billion. Well, what Congress has authorized so far is 7 billion. Where's the rest of the money coming from to make the digital infrastructure work? Similarly, in Europe, we now have somebody responsible for the digital agenda, as it's known. But there you see a reluctance of governments, because of the debt problems, I guess, to invest in infrastructures. But we desperately, I think, need these infrastructures so as to be able to be really competitive in the global market.
Kim Hart of the Politico.
Hi, Ms. Schaake. Thank you for joining us. I wanted to jump right into what the Netherlands is doing on the net neutrality front. Recently, the country was the first to kind of take net neutrality forward and international law by banning mobile telephone operators from blocking certain services or paying extra fees for that. Can you tell us a little bit about how that law came into being and what it means going forward for the country and the EU at large?
Yes. What we saw was actually a shareholders meeting where one of the board members of the largest telecom provider in the Netherlands, called KPN, was sort of bragging to shareholders that they were able to use deep packet inspections, the monitoring of the traffic of their users, to identify whether voice over IP services such as Skype or WhatsApp were used in order to make sure that those services were not competing with their own business model of sending text messages and using cell phone service as we commonly know it. And while that might have been a great argument to shareholders to protect a certain business model, this was not the users in the Netherlands appreciated, because they felt that a potentially free of cost service was actually denied to them. And in principle, the belief is that through transparency, telecom providers do in terms of monitoring traffic or blocking, consumers have a choice to move. So competition could be a solution to keep the open internet neutral, to have net neutrality safeguarded. But it was soon discovered that actually competitors also used the same techniques to monitor traffic, and that's when initially the government had said, we're just going to look whether civil liberties have been violated, so that's an investigation we're doing. But on the competition side, we don't see a need for action. And then the parliament actually stepped in, and a majority of parliamentarians said that there was a need to step in to actually guarantee net neutrality by law. And actually my political party initiated that motion, as we call it, and it ended up being and so now net neutrality is enshrined in law. And I think what it's going to do in Europe is set off a domino effect, where consumers throughout Europe are going to be curious whether free services are actually denied to them, whether our telecom providers are monitoring their traffic in a way that actually violates civil liberties and fundamental rights and freedoms. And so I think it will be the start of a bigger discussion in the EU policy circles for the digital agenda that James mentioned. Her name is Commissioner Kroes. She has already started a research or an investigation into the practices of net neutrality, and she has said that depending on the outcome of that research or investigation, she will take action, but she's awaiting that for the moment.
And so you mentioned the concept of competition and consumers being able to basically, if they're not getting what they think they should be getting, they can always move to a different competitor. What is competition like in this space in your country and in Europe? And feel free to either one of you chime in. Are there enough to really allow consumers to go to a different service provider and receive the same amount of service, or is it?
Well, in theory, I would say that there is competition. There are a number of players. KPN in the Netherlands has about 45% of the market share. It's the previously state-run telecom provider, which has been privatized. And the reason that the regulator couldn't step in is because it has no % of the market share. So that's how our regulators operate. After ownership of 50%, a majority market share, they can step in. But what was found out within hours was that the competitors actually deploy the same practices. And so even though in theory there's a choice, in practice it makes no difference. And I think that is very important when we look at net neutrality. The argument of transparency and competition, I think, is valid. Nobody would want over-regulation of the internet. I'm very much against over-regulating the internet, but sometimes regulation is necessary to keep the internet open. And that's a very different objective to safeguard competition, to safeguard people's fundamental rights and freedoms from, let's say, over-regulating for the sake of giving government control over the internet, which is undesirable. But keeping the internet open and competition healthy, I think, is very much desirable. And the minister in the Netherlands quite literally said that the telecoms had overstepped their space. They had pushed their luck. And this was why this regulation was necessary.
And Mr. Ellis, if you would also address Kim's question about competition.
Well, I mean, listen, I think in the United Kingdom we have a rather interesting emerging situation from, it's right on the top of the headlines and the broadsheets about who owns the media and why they own it. It comes from one specific problem in one specific newspaper. There's a big particular question about how this is going to be regulated in the future, and I personally feel that the more freedom we have and the less kind of domination of any one particular individual or one organization, we've got a really good opportunity now, I think, to sort this one out. Well, the theme I'd like to come back to was to build on my answer to the last question, which was on the fact that the internet is global, and that we see a rise of real power in the East, in Asia, in China. It's often part of the debates in this country and in Europe. But what we're trying to look at this week is to see how do we have a transatlantic agenda on dealing with some of these really important issues for telecommunications, for the digital sector, like cloud computing. How can we have parameters which are based on freedom, on the place of access and the question of information and infrastructure, whereas other countries we know aren't quite so focused as this kind of thing. And so how we get an emerging agenda is going to be the interests of both Europe and America. But sometimes these digital questions come seen too much, one on the American side and one on the European side. The more that we can get a transatlantic debate going on these, where we have a very similar approach to things, but where we don't actually often have the opportunity to have these kinds of debates and understanding that our interests are very much in common, we very much hope that we can make a real good progress, not just about the transatlantic thing, but about cooperation in multilateral fora, where there's a number of things on international internet governance and things like that, where it's really important at this particular stage where IPv6 maybe give the chance to the Chinese to have their own internet network, or maybe the Arabian Peninsula, whatever, because they can do it in terms of language. How do you keep the multilateral system running is going to be a major question for us.
And so building on that idea, because the internet is this global network, and the information growing on that is just growing by the day, how do you make sure that how do you handle the privacy issue, I guess? How do you ensure that people are using the internet as efficiently as they want to, and also trusting to use the internet by protecting what they're doing there, by protecting their personal information? What does, in the UK, how does the UK approach privacy regulation?
Well, if I can look at this on this one on a European basis on protection of intellectual property rights, where in the thinking of some, where we're thinking if you've got global systems, we need to have a transatlantic market, where you have the principle of freedom of movement of goods, services, people and capital right across the transatlantic zone. Part of that would be proper coordination between the US and the EU on protecting intellectual property rights on emerging technologies. Secondly, if we can coordinate our positions, the US and the EU, on our approach to third countries and the protection of intellectual property, China is a perfect example of that, then we can begin to make some real progress on these things, because I sense sometimes the change is so phenomenally fast in the technological sector, where we see from Facebook and the way in which people place their trust and their information on it, and maybe now saying, goodness me, we shouldn't have done that, because we're now no longer sure what's going to happen to that information, and private companies own the information. They can basically do what they like with it. It's a really important central point to the protection of privacy and information of individuals, which I sense sometimes maybe in the political world, decisions have been taken, but the speed with which technology moves, every time you get a piece of legislation in, the picture has moved on a much faster pace. So the more that we can be aware as legislators of the picture, and the more that we can coordinate our positions together, I think the better we'll all be off.
How will you be able to describe the coordination thus far? I know you're trying to increase the coordination, but how would you describe the coordination between the US and the EU on a lot of these internet governance issues? Do you think that there's a lot of parity there on some of the things we've already been talking about, or do you think that there needs to be a lot more discussion?
Well, personally, because if you're starting off from this basis, the internet is global, and that you have real risks of dangers of imbalances occurring over the next decades, because as you can see the way the trends are going, we need a much more intensified cooperation on these issues, where if you're talking to Ambassador Verveer, for example, from the State Department, you go through the list of issues, say, hey, these are exactly the same kind of issues that we're dealing with, but we don't have the frameworks at this stage to allow the right kind of people to talk with each other, and the sooner that we strengthen these frameworks, for my price, particularly in the political community, the better.
Ms.
Yeah,
Schaake?
I agree that that's necessary, but I also think that there are some differences between the EU and the US. That doesn't have to be a problem. I think we can be complementary and good in a good alliance with each other, but each has their own role to play. And when we look at issues such as SWIFT, you know, the storing of financial transaction data of EU citizens, which are shipped in bulk to the United States to be monitored by a private entity. That leads to serious questions about democratic oversight, and we see sort of a backlash of that on the EU side. The other issue is that of fragmentation. James mentioned intellectual property rights. I think that's indeed a very important topic, but also an area in which in Europe we need reform in order to benefit from the opportunities that the digital environment brings to access greater amounts of audiences and to actually use the benefits that the internet has without seeking not to take care of the creators, but we have to rebalance that. And in terms of balance, I think this always plays out almost as a rule between in the relation between the US and the EU, that the US tends to have a strong emphasis on security. We saw this in the war on terror. We see this again in the discussions about cybersecurity, where I believe that it's Europe's role and also obligation to balance the freedom arguments. There is no such thing as 100% security. We may strive to seek a responsible level of security. It's our obligation to protect the well-being and the security of our citizens. But we also must make sure that such measures do not actually strangle what makes the internet and new technologies of such great opportunity and such enhancers of freedom. The US is very strong on internet freedom in the international context. Secretary Clinton is focusing and investing a lot in the development of tools to circumvent censorship, filtering, blocking, and to help human rights defenders and basically people to freely express themselves, to gain access to information, to document human rights abuses. I think this is wonderful, but the potential to limit those opportunities also lies in an overemphasis on security and allowing for very, very far-reaching measures into people's private conversations and access to information. So this balance is crucial. And on a positive note, I do think that the EU and the US can complement each other and really help find that right balance, and they should definitely do that together.
Do you see, because of what's happening in the UK right now with the News of the World issue, a strengthening of security issues when it comes to telecommunications policy in the EU?
Well, perhaps not directly related to what's happening in the UK, but in general. We sometimes are led to believe that internet has changed everything. But in the basis, the fundamental rights, human rights and freedoms of people are not changed. And governments still have to protect those. There's a lot of discussion in the UK of whether there is more regulation needed now, whether a special body should be developed. And I think that the judge and the rule of law should first do its work. And there's a natural tendency, which we see all over the world, to have a strong reaction when something goes wrong. The same happens in the cybersecurity discussions, but we must also learn from the past. And I think especially in the US, when we look back on the impact that the war on terror had and the damage it has done when it comes to civil liberties and the protection of human rights, that is still not solved. And that balance is very, very important. And the government and politicians like ourselves have a responsibility to protect both. And with new technologies, the difference is that a lot of decision makers have difficulty understanding to the full extent how these technologies impact our societies and the lives of our citizens. And on top of that, the speed of developments in the technological atmosphere are much faster than policy making. I mean, policy making at the moment is running behind the technological developments all the time. While people are talking about downloading and how to deal with that, streaming is the new thing, and the next thing is already looking around the corner. So I think we should work towards framework policies which guarantee human rights and fundamental freedoms, within which technologies can develop freely without us facing the need to adjust policy at each and every step, because it's simply not feasible.
Mr. Elles?
Yeah, I think that I mean, this is all part of a tremendous revolution which we're living in. I mean, often people have quoted Gutenberg and the press being something similar way back in the 15th century, where, you know, people had the right to print, and that then gave a basis for democracy because you had paper and you were able then to use pieces of information to be able to get people properly informed. What we have today is an extraordinary thing, as you were saying, Kim, of having access to information at any time from your own machine, of information which is doubling, they say, every day or every half day or every 2 hours, of the mass of information doubling. So it becomes a question of how do you prioritize your information, how do you get access to information, and as a decision maker saying, and we are in the European Parliament, the decision maker on most of the framework laws dealing with e-commerce across the European Union, which is 500 million people, then you've got to get it right. And this is one of the roles of the European Internet Foundation, where we work very closely with the Internet Education Foundation in the Congress. We're doing something in town on Thursday morning on privacy and intellectual property, actually, so that we can be able to, the idea is not to take sudden decisions because you get a huge pressure from one lobby which comes in and blasts all the legislators saying, this is the way you got to do it. And guys don't have any slightest idea about the quality of the discussion, so they might go with that. What we try to do is it's an all-party approach, of getting the right kind of experts from the telecoms, from the software companies, from all the experts that we can do, to be able to get better information, therefore to get better legislation, and not to legislate, as Mariette was rightly saying, you want freedom of the internet in so much as you can guarantee it, but you have to guarantee the rights of the people so that they can actually have confidence in it, and confidence is extremely important.
This is C-SPAN's Communicators program. Our guests this week, both members of the European Parliament. Marietje Schaake is from the Netherlands, and she represents the party called the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. James Elles, a member of the Conservative Party for the UK. Kim Hart is with the Politico.
And you just mentioned you 500 million people in the EU that you want to be connected to the internet and to have all of the access and benefits that come along with the internet. Wireless, I'm sure, is a big part of connecting these people in all parts, rural and remote islands and so on. What is the spectrum situation like in Europe? As I'm sure you know, that's a big topic of conversation here with the spectrum shortage, and how are we going to maximize the use of the commercially available spectrum in order to make mobile broadband more available. Can you tell us a little bit about what that situation is like in Europe?
Well, we've just worked on a report in the European Parliament. I was also involved with that regarding spectrum policy in Europe, because it's a hot topic for us just the same. And there's going to be a revision, actually, of the spectrum policy coming up. And one of the issues that is necessary now is to actually do an assessment of where each member state of the EU stands. Because we have countries which are economically at a different level, which have developed spectrum policies historically in different ways. And so what's necessary first is to assess how the situation around spectrum is in each member state according to the same thresholds, so that there's an assessment. And I think we must make sure that the new spectrum policy is future-proof, that it allows for the development of new technologies while, of course, safeguarding the use by the military, by certain cultural players. And we are well on our way to look at a more future-proof basis, but also to make sure that the EU does act as one global player in, for example, multilateral fora, which deal with spectrum, and where now there's 27 different voices, different systems, and we must really go in the direction of the EU as a global player to be competitive and to be clear about where we stand and to make the wise decisions. And we also looked into the possibilities of being a little bit more flexible with the use of spectrum, because, for example, on the part of military and police services, some spectrum is more like a reserve for an emergency situation. Some people use spectrum, or some players use spectrum more during the day, others more in the evening. So how can we be flexible and ensure that we use the capacity we have and that people can have their fair share, and that we do move along with the speed of technological developments?
Yeah, on that subject, last Friday I was in my district at a major company called Vodafone, and they have a network operations center which said precisely that. You could see it on the graphics of where people download the stuff. Don't necessarily do so much on the weeks, but then on the weekends. So you can see the pattern of people's habits, and it comes through their use and downloading whatever they do, or streamlining streaming the information. What struck me, though, here was that Spectrum has, if you like, stayed still while technology has changed, and where mobiles used to be used for voice, now they're used for videos. So I'm told by the mobile operators that, of course, lots of people download, children and adults, but more perhaps in adults, of downloading videos. Well, of course, that's huge capacity. It overloads the system. People can't use it for voice. It's then difficult if you're going to try to get broadband downloads. So in my area in Oxfordshire, which is, after all, really quite, I think, a civilized area in Europe and in Britain, I live in a place I don't have a mobile signal. Most people have broadband speed, which is less than 1 Mbps, which takes about 10 minutes to download a page. I mean, this is something which comes back to a comment I'm making earlier about infrastructure, digital infrastructure. It's really important for small businesses to be able to do this. And there's a figure out there about a year ago that if we invested 15 billion euros, it's about, I don't know, $12 billion dollars to be, if I got the correction right, but it may be $20 billion. It's something of that kind of area, 15 to $20 billion, that you did it for mobile and broadband, you probably create something over 500,000 jobs, because it's the small businesses which need to be connected, but they're not today connected other than rather arbitrarily, depending if they can get a signal or if they can get a download speed if they're not working at a particular time when everybody else is doing things. So I think that here it's really important to get the spectrum right, and that's where the discussions will come as to whether mobile operators should actually contribute to be able to putting some money along with public money to make sure everybody gets coverage. Because if you have the internet and it allows you to be a consumer and therefore having some dominance over the information that you get, it's kind of bizarre that, you know, it's like buying a car and not having a road. You need, if you buy a mobile, to be able to use it, and to be able to use it at any part of the system where you are.
And following up on something that you just said in terms of how whether private companies will combine with public money to be able to build this out, how do you incentivize the private companies and the wireless companies to really invest in their networks and make sure that people are receiving the kinds of speeds that you think are more viable for business use or even just personal use?
Well, I quoted a figure a bit earlier about the American state of having a large sum of money and then there's only a small amount the Congress will do.
Right.
My sense is that companies would be prepared to do that so long as it can be economically justifiable. Then they probably pay less into the Treasury on taxes. So, I mean, the money goes round in a way that if it's going to, though, generate business, if it's going to allow people to invest, and that's what I think we have to realize in a global system. Can I just have a short story of half a minute of one of my local business guys I saw 2 months back. He said, look, I'm in Oxfordshire, but I can't get broadband and stuff. He went off to New Delhi, to India, and he said, good Lord, you know, there are people washing clothes around a lake, and said, well, I'll never stay here. But actually, within 3 weeks, he got broadband 3 times the speed he can get at home, and he said, well, I'm operating in a global market, I'm staying here. So this is just, if you like, one tiny example of the way in which businesses of any size, to be competitive in global systems, will take by walking by themselves, at being able to invest in a place where they can get the right kind of service and the infrastructure.
Well, Marietje Schaake, in a recent interview, you commented that you don't have Wi-Fi in your office in Brussels.
Well, I'm afraid that our institutions are not always as opened up and as connected as they should be. There's a lot of opportunity there, both when it comes to simple things as Wi-Fi, but also when it comes to open data and collaborative policy making. I think we, as policy makers, must drag our institutions into the 21st century to be more connected to citizens and to use the opportunities of interaction, connection, communication, and collaborative processes that these new media bring. So we have a lot of work to do in our own house as well, and that's actually relevant on a number of issues, because we can only be credible in the rest of the world and credible towards our citizens if we practice what we preach.
And very quickly, Mr. Ellis, what's your biggest frustration when it comes to telecommunications policy in the EU?
I think that it's to do with leaderships. That what we have seen now with the body we have within the European Commission, we have our commissioner, Dutch commissioner, as we were mentioning, in charge of the digital agenda, wanting to be sure we get the right kind of broadband speeds by 2015. I worry personally whether those objectives are not actually ambitious enough, given the way in which the global economy is moving so quickly. And it's a frustration that many don't consider digital as being part of the main policy areas. Digital is something over there for others, nerds and others who might understand something about these new technologies. We came across yesterday a nice phrase of digital native, of anybody under 25, or Marietje too, I think, who's natural because you grow up with it. There's a whole generation, like people like myself, who've come to it. You have to adapt to the fact that the internet has come and provided a huge revolution. You're adapting to this revolution as you go. You're doing your job. Say, gosh, how does this all fit together? I really would like people to take time out for a moment or two and to, actually like the US president, who I think understands the internet probably better than most, to be able to understand this, to explain it, and to say this is something not to be afraid of, but it's something which is really going to help you do your job and make sure that we can indeed be competitive and communicate in the future.
Ms. Schaake, same question. Biggest frustration?
The fragmentation in Europe and the difficulties of understanding the real scope that this change brings on the part of leadership. In that sense, I fully agree with James. I think there's an increasing gap between a young generation of entrepreneurs, consumers, students, citizens who are living in Europe and who expect certain services, connectivity, expect to be able to make certain choices, and their political leaders have a difficulty grasping what's going on. And every day that Europe is fragmented and doesn't get its act together and acts as a global player, harmonizes the digital market, China, Brazil, the US get ahead of us, and we owe it to the opportunity and the potential of Europe to bring the whole European Union in to the 21st century and connected. And this requires a lot of work, but it's very urgent that we get there. So that's my main concern. And
very quickly, here in Washington, are your mobile devices working, and what's been your experience?
My mobile devices work.
At a good
speed? It's just very expensive.
Is it expensive?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, mine too. I haven't had a problem. I must say, coming from my place where I live, where I don't get one at all, it's a real thing to not to have to go down the road for 2 miles to go and get a signal. It's nice to be able to get one when you want one.
James Elles has been a member of the European Parliament since 1984. He's also co-founder of the European Internet Foundation. Marietje Schaake has been a member of the Parliament since 2009 from the Netherlands. We appreciate you both coming over onto the Communicators. Kim Hart, as always, of the Politico, thank you as well.
Thank you.